Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I am super excited about today's video. It's something I've been working on and thinking about for a little while, and have just really been looking forward to sharing it with you. So as you will know if you watch my channel, and you won't know if you are new here, my name is Kendyll and I am a full-time professional commercial illustrator, which means that I work with clients in packaging, in advertising, in editorials, like for magazines, in surface design, all sorts of different things. And this is a career that I have kind of made my way into. So my background, my education was not in any sort of commercial art. It was in fine art. So learning how to be a commercial artist, learning how to be an illustrator and a freelancer has been something that I've kind of done on my feet as I went along. And one of the things that was really challenging about that was kind of understanding some of the lingo and some of the terms that would be used both by other illustrators and by prospective clients when they would contact me. And back when I was first getting started, I had a lot of anxiety about that. And I'd get an email from a client, or I would consider emailing a client, either way. And I would just be overwhelmed with this feeling of like, oh gosh, I don't know if I'm using the right terms, or what is this term that the client said? What does that mean? So I figured I would kind of compile a list of some of the most important terms, some of the ones that I found the most confusing, and explain them to you guys. So before we dive in, I do want to say a quick thank you to my patrons, since they are the ones who are sponsoring this video. My patrons support this channel financially, and they make it possible for me to have a video editor, which makes it possible for me to put out weekly videos, even though I am a working full-time freelance illustrator. So thank you so much to my patrons. Thank you to my wonderful video editor, Meg. And if you are interested in supporting this channel financially, you can follow the link in the description box to my Patreon page. And if you're not able to support the channel financially, I totally get that. Another great thing that you can do is to share this content if you find it helpful. So whether you're sharing it in your Insta stories or on Twitter, your Facebook page, wherever, just helping to get the word out and build the audience is also another really great way, a super meaningful way to support the channel. So thank you to everybody who supports and pitches in the way that you do. You are the ones making it possible. So without further ado, we are going to dive right into this video. Okay, so we're going to cover 8 terms, and there are other terms that are industry specific and that relate to important things in illustration and commercial art, but we're just going to kind of start with these 8 since these are ones that I personally found kind of overwhelming and wasn't sure about, and they're also some of the ones that are the most important if you're just getting ready to kind of get your feet in the water of commercial art. So the first term is an art director. Sometimes you'll hear this person referred to as an AD, a creative director, a design director. This is basically just the person, well, I'm not going to go into their job description because it really could be super different depending on which kind of company they work for, even down to like lots of different art directors in different magazines might have specific responsibilities within that specific magazine. So I'm not going to give like a job description for an art director, but I'm going to describe how they would relate to you. So as the illustrator. So basically the art director is the person who has sourced your work. So they're the one, usually, not always, but they're usually the one who has found you, whether it's online or on Pinterest or on Instagram, just by doing a Google search, whatever. And they're the one who's going to work with you directly to produce the final illustrations. So as I said, they could have even other titles than the ones that I mentioned. Sometimes a person who functions as an art director just has the title of designer. It totally depends on the organization, but usually most illustrators will still refer to that person as the AD or the art director when they're giving, especially like if they're posting in their portfolio or on social media and they're giving credit to the art director, which is kind of the courteous expected thing to do. You just give that person a nod since they usually worked with you to help develop the concept. And the extent to which they'll work with you, like how involved they'll be, really, again, varies. It depends on lots of things, including the type of illustration that you do. If you do like really conceptual work, probably an AD is going to be more involved because they're going to want to really influence that concept. If you do really realistic work like I do, they may just have a few specific notes. And it can also vary from company to company, client to client. So there are some art directors that I work with that are just like, hey, can you do this? And they have no specific direction other than to do it in my usual style. And then other art directors that will be really, really specific about like lighting and texture and shadows and placement and all sorts of different things. So basically the fundamental definition is just the art director is the person who you are liaising with, your liaison within the company, within the organization or the client that you're working with. All right, and the next term is a quote. Sometimes you'll hear this referred to also as an estimate or a proposal. And again, there can be some variety in how these terms are used. Often a client will reach out to you and ask you to provide a quote or an estimate. And ideally, at least the way I tend to use this language, I'll use quote and estimate interchangeably to be kind of a succinct but hopefully really clear and thorough description of what a project will cost and what it will entail. And then a proposal might be something that would be a little bit more detailed, would include, would include a timeline, maybe some more robust pieces of information about how you work. But basically, if a client gets in contact with you asking for a quote, an estimate, a proposal, they are asking to know how much the work costs. And in addition to telling them how much the work costs, you should also tell them like what the project is going to entail, because you could say, oh yes, this illustration will cost $400. And the client is thinking, all right, so for $400, I'm going to get whatever illustration I want, and I'm going to have as many revisions as I want. So it's on you as the business person, as the small business owner, the illustrator, to tell the client what specifically this will cost and what specifically they're going to be getting for that price. And depending on the size of the client that you're working with, the way that you feel comfortable working, the timeline, all sorts of different things, you may decide just to go with the kind of email train of your back and forth that would cover the information that you included in your quote or your estimate and the client agreeing to that. You might sort of stop at that point. And for myself, often if I'm working for an editorial client, that will be all that ends up happening, because there's such a tight turnaround. So essentially the email chain functions as your contract. But if you're working on a larger project, larger in terms of budget, larger in terms of scope or length of time, then you probably will move on to something that's a bit more formal, like a contract that would include all of the details of the project. So the quote, the estimate, maybe the proposal, those are kind of the rough description of what the project is going to cost and what the project will entail. So what the client is getting for that cost. All right, and the next term is the artistic brief. So you can hear this sometimes just referred to as the brief. Sometimes it'll be creative direction or just direction. And basically the brief is information that is provided to you by the client to describe what they want, what the artistic goals for the project are. And again, like these other terms that we've mentioned, there can be a pretty big variety in terms of how structured the brief is, how much information is included. Typically, you'll want the art director or the person who's providing the brief to be as specific as possible. That's always going to be to your advantage when they provide more information, since it gives you a better idea, a clearer sense of what they're looking for. And a really thorough, in my opinion, helpful, solid brief or direction, whatever you want to call it, is going to include some text description, some written description of what the client is looking for, a list of the exact illustrations that they need, hopefully anything like size requirements or ultimate DPI requirements for when they're getting the final deliverables. We'll talk about that term too in a minute. And then most importantly, at least for me, most importantly, are visual examples. And again, a really great brief will have will provide the photo references that the client wants me to use so that I don't have to spend time sourcing those. And then also specific examples from my portfolio where the client will point out, oh, okay, we really like this style element, we like that style element. Sometimes even they'll include ones on the opposite side, like maybe don't have quite as much texture as this piece has, or make the highlights softer than they are in this piece. Basically, as much information, as many examples as possible. That makes for a really robust and thorough brief. Sometimes that'll come to you, usually, if it's a really thorough brief, it'll come to you in the form of a PDF. Sometimes if it's not as thorough, or if it's a faster project, a smaller project, the client will just include a few notes in the body of an email. But regardless, it is still something that you should always ask for. You should ask for creative direction, ask for an artistic brief, whether it's going to be an email or a PDF, just because as the artist, you do want that information and you do want to have a really clear sense of what the client is looking for in the project. And again, depending on the project, this may be something that the client sends to you in their very first email when they first reach out to you. Usually those are kind of the higher power clients, the ones who are used to commissioning illustrators, who do it all the time. They tend to know what information the illustrator needs up front in order to provide an accurate quote. So yeah, you can have a sense that that would be really helpful when they do that. However, there are plenty of clients that I work with, even some high power clients, who don't provide the brief until after you kind of go through the details of the quote, in which case you still have to pick out some information. You have to get them to give you some information like the size and the subject and the scope, the number of illustrations, all of that. So it could be something that comes at the very beginning of the project, or it could be something that comes like when you're signing the contract and getting ready to work. So either way, I have a kind of personal policy that the client has to provide me with what they want for direction before I put together the contract, because once I put together the contract, I'll transfer over a lot of the language that they have from the brief to make sure that we are both clear that this is what they asked for and this is what they're getting. So yeah, it can be a few different phases of the project, but always make sure you get it before you nail down the contract. All right, the next term is an NDA. And maybe this is not as confusing to people anymore, excuse me, but when I was first getting started, I had several clients email me saying that they would need me to sign an NDA, and I was like, oh my gosh, what's that? Or I would see other illustrators online posting stuff saying like how they couldn't share their work because it was all NDA'd. They'd use it as a verb. And an NDA is just a non-disclosure agreement. And basically, this is just a document that the client may ask you to sign before they give you additional information about a project. So I've signed so many of these over the years, and many of them from like really big, cool clients that didn't actually end up panning out. So typically you'll be asked to sign an NDA if it's for a really well-known brand, so a brand that would have a lot of name recognition, and maybe they're just exploring a project. They're not like totally sure whether they're gonna carry it out all the way. So they just want to get a sense from some different illustrators, but they're not prepared to like lock things down yet. So an NDA is kind of a way that that client can protect themselves and make sure you're not going to be running out there being like, oh my gosh, Nickelodeon just commissioned me, or I've never been contacted by Nickelodeon. They would never contact someone with my kind of work. But I was just thinking of like a big name that a lot of people would know, or like, I don't know, what's a big food name, like Dole or something like that. If some really big brand contacts you, it's a way for them to protect themselves and make sure that you're not out there name dropping or giving away secrets about the project. Because a lot of the time when they're reaching out to illustrators, they're thinking about developing either like a new line or running a new ad campaign, and they want to have control over when that information gets released to the world. So it's a very normal thing. You shouldn't be nervous about signing them. However, just like any contractor agreement, you should always read it thoroughly and make sure there are no surprises in there. So that is an NDA. All right, the next term is Skew. And a Skew is this is a term that's pretty specific to like more retail illustration or packaging or product illustration, sometimes to surface pattern illustration. Skew just stands for stock keeping unit, and basically it's just another term for a product. So it might not be unusual for a client who is developing packaging illustration, for example, to reach out and say, we need illustration for 8 SKUs. And all that means is we need illustration for 8 different products. So that one's pretty straightforward. All right, and the next term is sketch. And most people who are into art at all know the word sketch very well, but the way that it can be used in illustration and in commercial illustration, I remember being kind of overwhelmed and unsure about like what exactly was expected from a sketch or what the client would mean when they would ask to see sketches. Some other terms you could hear are thumbnails or pencils sometimes, or roughs or outlines, basically just anything that's going to indicate a unfinished kind of rough draft version of the illustration. And to that end, there really is no specific expectation or meaning that's universal across the board with all clients, with all illustrators, of what is expected of you in terms of producing a sketch. So this, again, is going to really depend on the client, what they want, and on your style of work. So speaking from myself, since my style is pretty straightforward and realistic, there isn't really much conceptual development that goes on, that goes into the illustration. Most of the time, I just will provide 1 to 2 sketches, and a sketch is just a simple pencil outline. Mine do tend to be pretty realistic because I'm trying to show the client this is the outline. This is the starting point for what I'm going to develop into your final illustration. But if you're a really conceptual illustrator and doing like lots of kind of maybe editorial illustration where you're doing work to support abstract ideas or concepts, it would probably be a lot more common for you to do more sketches, maybe in the realm of like 3 to 5. And in that case, they usually would be much rougher, not as polished or finished as mine would. And then they might be called thumbnails. So there is this pretty big spectrum of, somebody just providing a single sketch that's a highly polished outline to someone providing 3, 4, 5, 6 different little thumbnails that are really rough and really quick that just depict a basic concept. The most important thing, the most important thing for you as an illustrator is to be upfront and clear about what your process is with the client. So you can say, typically I will provide for this kind of project, for what you're asking, typically I'll provide 3 thumbnails. And if the client says, oh, actually, you know what, we really need to have 4 thumbnails, or if they want more thumbnails, they can let you know. But just being really clear and upfront about what you mean by the sketch and what goes into the sketch phase is going to be super helpful. But there isn't any universal expectation about what it has to be. All right, the next term, and this is one that we mentioned already, we referred to at the top of the video, is a deliverable. And this is another one that kind of really threw me when I was getting started, and clients would refer to the deliverables, and I was like, what the heck does that mean? Does that mean stuff that I have to have the postal service deliver to them? What's a deliverable? A deliverable, or the deliverables, is a specific term that includes the actual final files that are in the form that the client is paying you for. So if you are doing something commercially and you're creating work for a magazine or for fabric or a greeting card or whatever, the deliverables are pretty much always going to be digital. So the deliverable is the final PSD file or the JPEG or the TIFF or whatever form you're delivering it to the client in. That is the deliverable. And the reason it's helpful to have a specific word as opposed to just saying the finals is that usually you will show the client a low-res version of the finals before they approve it and before you send along the deliverables. So, and also you'll see that word in contracts all the time. It's usually what, it's the typical term for a contract in terms of the product that you are producing for the client. So the deliverable is the specific actual final file that the client is getting at the end of the project. All right, and here we are at the last term. The last term is Clearcut or Clean Cut. And I'll be honest, this is not one I've seen many clients use in the last year or two. But when I was first getting started, I had a few kind of larger scale clients use this term, and it really threw me for a loop, and I didn't know what it meant, and I felt very silly having to ask, what do you mean by that? So I felt like it was important to include it here just in case any of you are in that boat. But basically, a clear cut or a clean cut illustration just refers to the illustration itself having been removed from the background. So if you can imagine, if you are like me and you work in a lot of watercolor and mixed media, you scan the image in, you end up with the image, but then there's all the kind of paper texture around it. And if the client is hoping to drop that image into a layout, whether it's in a magazine or on a package or on a pattern, whatever it may be, it it's much more convenient for the client if the image has already been removed from the background. Typically, Clearcut means like that it actually has been cut away from the background, not just that the background has been that the noise has been turned down or it's been made to be a kind of a uniform white, but it actually has been cut or separated from the background so that you can end up with something that has a transparent background. So a really common way that I will kind of clarify and make sure that I'm on the same page with the client is just to say that the final deliverables will be provided as a high-res TIFF with a transparent background. And that's just a way to make sure that they understand what you mean and that you're on the same page and everybody is getting what they want. Okay, so that is it for this video. Hopefully you found it helpful, learned some new terms, feel a little bit more confident about operating in the world of freelance illustration. If there are other terms that you have questions about, or if you have follow-up questions about terms that we covered in this video, feel free to leave those in the comments. If we have enough of those, then I can make a follow-up video. And thank you again to Meg for the wonderful editing and to all of you all for watching. Please do subscribe if you're new and like and comment and share and all of that good stuff. And I will see you in the next video. Bye.